So welcome to the second panel discussion in the Building Bridges for Sustainable Change webinar series. Today's webinar is seeking to delve more deeply into the way that the investment community handles ESG information. This topic stems from a tectonic shift that we've seen where companies are starting to move from single materiality, which aims at addressing sustainable factors affecting the financial value of a company, to more double materiality, which is taking it a step further by also considering the impact that a company might have on the planet and society. To address this topic, we've compiled a diverse set of sustainability experts with insights from the perspective of companies issuing public or private market debt and how they are adapting to ESG considerations. We'll also hear about municipalities' increasing use of sustainability-oriented private debt to help local communities meet their net zero targets. So while many of you in the audience are involved in the arena of sustainability, we anticipate today's discussion to provide fresh insights from a variety of stakeholders within the ecosystem and serve as a forum for stronger lines of communication. So before we begin, let's start with a brief introduction to all the speakers. My name is Lydia Schreiber. I'm a senior investment executive with a passion for sustainability. And I'm also a trustee on the board of the One World Trust, who's co-sponsoring the webinar series in collaboration with Action for Sustainable Development. I'll be moderating today's panel. So now I'll hand it over to the other speakers to briefly introduce themselves before I kick it off with the first question. So Martina, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Lydia, and hi, everyone. My name is Martina Musudi, and I work at Fitch Ratings. I work in the ESG and Sustainable Finance Department, and in my role, I work closely with issuers as well as with bankers and advisors in the context of ESG ratings and new debt capital markets transactions that are labeled bonds. Prior to joining Fitch, I was in banking. For 12 years in front office roles. So the perspective that I bring to this panel is the perspective of public markets. It's the perspective of what the investors may require in their investment decision-making process and how the issuer may respond to such needs. Thank you. Over to Carl, please.
Hello, thank you, Martina, and thank you, Lydia. So I'm Carl Harder, one of the co-founders and managing director of Abundance Investment, and we're a sort of crowdfunding platform that raise money from citizens to back the decarbonisation of the UK. We fund, as Lydia sort of referenced, companies delivering net zero projects as sort of private debt, but also a growing part of what we do is allowing citizens to fund their municipalities, their local council, to deliver the council's climate emergency plan. So, and we do that under the sort of green bond principles framework. So I'll be coming at this from a slightly sort of more micro perspective, looking at sort of private market company debt and the municipal side and that relationship between citizens, their money and the places that they put it to work. Thank you. Over to Tony.
Thank you, Carl. My name is Dr. Tony Lanier. I work at BDO. I'm a director here at the Sustainability and ESG Hub. I've been doing my specialty is actually the digital side of things, so the data around ESG and sustainability, as well as sustainable finance. And I've been doing sustainable finance for nearly 30 years. I was the first managing director of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And I've most recently worked with the UN on innovative financial products to support and finance the UN SDGs. And I've worked at a fintech company looking at capital flows and facilitating capital flows to developing and delivering the UN SDGs from a city perspective as well as a company perspective. I come at this from very much a data side of things, because I think that's one of the areas that you can be the best investor in the world, but if you don't have data that you can rely on that's robust and clear, then it's really incredibly challenging to make well-informed investment decision as well as business decisions. So I'm looking forward to joining the conversation, and hopefully it will be very, very lively.
Excellent. Thank you all for your introduction. So let's not waste any more time. Let's kick it off with the first question. Now, when we think about environmental, social, and governance, ES&G, a term used by the investment community, and we also think about the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted as a universal call to action. What we've seen is that there's been ties when it comes to these two frameworks when you think about sustainable investing. And there's an interesting interplay. Now, is ESG investing the same as investing in the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Martina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Lydia. Well, the trouble with the term ESG is that it is very, very widely used, and it actually means very different things to different people. And my answer will sort of refer to, again, the term of double materiality. On one side, ESG investing can mean that an investor is taking into account financially material ESG risks that are posed to the company by the external environment. And on the other side of things, on the side of the impact materiality, ESG investing may mean that the investor is investing in order to achieve positive environmental or social objectives. So we have to differentiate between those two routes that will inevitably result in very different portfolio compositions. So in the first route, if the investor is integrating financially material ESG risks into their decision-making process, I wouldn't expect it to be aligned with investing in UN SDGs. That's simply focused on risk management and perhaps, picking the best company suited to a specific expected, say, change in regulation or financial impact coming from an environmental or social change. On the other side of it, if the investor is running a portfolio with a focus of achieving a positive environmental or social impact, there can be a high degree of alignment between this and the route of investing for UN SDGs. That obviously depends on how the investor will structure their portfolio, but there can be a high degree of alignment, because if we look at UN SDGs, they are all structured and designed to promote the positive impacts for the environment and the society. So it makes sense that the impact side of double materiality, if followed by investors, could be aligned with UN SDGs.
I think there's an element too, Lydia, to this that is that we could actually explore a little bit broader than that, insofar as that ESG is really seen as the measuring bit of it. So ESG itself is about the metrics. So you have ESG metrics and the measuring, whereas the UN SDGs is not about metrics per se, it's about the process and how the system needs to change in order to facilitate the delivery of some of the world's largest issues. So unless you have the metrics, which is the ESG side of things, you're not going to actually change the whole process. And that's the key element that I think that it gets missed sometimes, is that they are not the same, but one absolutely needs to hold the hand of the other. And the UN, working with the UN, I mean, that's incredibly clear when you talk to the best different member states, that what they're trying to do is change the process, change the system so that more people have access to institutions or to gender equality, et cetera. But they need those metrics through ESG in order to make that work, because you don't know where you need to go unless you can understand where you've been and what the road work and what the journey looks like.
It's an interesting point that you've made, both of you. And now when we think about, obviously, the implementation, the availability of information to make these decisions, Tani, you touched about ESG and sustainability-oriented data requirements. So from your perspective, you're very much involved on that side of the coin. What are some of the challenges that the current state of play regarding data has on companies, but as well as investors?
there's no real standardization. I think some of the legislation and regulation that's popping up through FRAG or the EU or the US or the UK is trying to address that about the standardization of the data. And it's incredibly difficult to make well-informed investment decisions if there's no robustness around the data and you can't be confident that it's correct. So that's really in my mind, that is the biggest challenge, because people have been gathering data around ESG and sustainability for, I mean, I've been at this for 30 years. The mere fact that you can't compare it and it's not very timely is one of the bigger challenges to investing in such a way that it makes a demonstrable impact and demonstrable way forward when it comes to delivering of SDGs or environmental issues or social issues as such. So that to me is the biggest challenge.
I think this plays into the sort of the big issue that we're probably all concerned about, which retail investors, which is where we're very much focused, and they're the people ultimately driving most of the money into the system. When they sort of understand ESG investing, they're thinking probably about the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that they're thinking about having real impact, and the risk, as Martina sort of flagged, is that a lot of ESG funds and process is just about an element of risk management and not really about moving things forward. And when we don't have the data to also clearly compare how different entities are moving forward on that journey to delivery of the SDGs, then again we have this sort of risk that the whole process gets undermined in the public side. And I think that's a key concern at the moment for, I suppose, the industry as a whole.
Would you say, Carl, that actually the retail investors know a lot about the UN SDGs? I'm always surprised when I go to a conference where it's about the UN SDGs and I ask the question, who knows about them? And there's a scattering of hands that know about the UN SDGs. So I'm really surprised actually that retail clients do know about the UN SDGs. I think they're focused on industry specific stuff like plastics in the ocean or climate change.
I think it's the outcome that the SDGs are trying to promote is what retail investors are looking for. They're expecting their investments when they think they're making one that's aligned with environmental and social improvement, that it's actually going to create change. That's why they're doing it, and to feel good about what their money is doing in the world. And when it's more of a risk management process and not about fundamental change, that's where we start to get the problems. So yes, SDG is not widely known, but it's the outcomes the SDG is looking to create are the things that motivate people.
Carl, and I think what's interesting as well, taking it a step further into local communities and municipalities, kind of drawing back into that realm of the crowdfunding that your platform is doing. How are local municipalities getting more involved in the green bond space? How are they using the private debt markets to try to attain their net zero targets?
So local authorities in the UK don't have a lack of borrowing. They've got good lines of borrowing they can take from central government. But we're working with councils, and it's 9 councils to date, the most recent being Westminster City Council in London, to issue bonds under the green loan principles, so aligned with what the UK government did with its green gilt. The reason they're doing that, their primary motivation is to communicate action to their citizens by issuing a green bond. They're shining a light on something they've done, which is positive, and use that to engage citizens. So we're in a position now where I think it's 80% of UK councils a climate emergency, which is not just decarbonising their region. And to decarbonise their region, they need to motivate and engage people with the transition. And part of that comes from showing that they're taking action, because that leadership prompts other change within the community. So the green bond programs that we're working on are very much about that communication piece. But to deliver that, we also have to save the council money on their borrowing and pass the value for money test. So that's a sort of precursor for being able to play in a sense, but it's primarily a communication and engagement tool for them.
Thank you, Carl. And I think when we think about green bonds, it's very much a specific type of labeled sustainable bond, right? Because the project funds have to be specific to these types of environmental projects.
Yeah.
If we turn back to Martina and the work that you do with a lot of public companies and getting their bonds rated and looking at the labeled bond market, can you touch a little bit about how the labeled bond market is actually helping investors and the investor community in general invest in the UN SDGs?
Yes, definitely. So let's start with just a broad overview of what the labeled bond market is. So the labeled bond market covers bond transactions that were issued as green, social, or sustainable transactions under the International Capital Markets Association principles for those bonds. And it also covers sustainability-linked bond transactions, again, under the ICMA principles. So within these types of transactions, the green, social, and sustainable are bonds within which the issuer essentially makes a commitment to use the proceeds of that bond for a particular project or set of projects or categories of projects that are predefined in the framework of that particular bond. So I would say that what the labeled bond, kind of market brings to investors is a high level of transparency with regards to what those proceeds will be used for. Because if you're investing in a company and there is sort of the general corporate purposes use of proceeds, then as an investor, you will not have visibility into exactly how those proceeds were used. Whereas if you invest in a green, social, or sustainable bonds, a use of proceeds bonds, the issuer will have committed at the beginning, so at the moment of putting the framework in place, what those proceeds will be used for. And then once the bond is issued, there are allocation reports that are published every year until full allocation of the bond has taken place. So as an investor, you have visibility into hopefully which projects those proceeds went to, not just categories, but these days we see that there is more sort of granularity in the reporting from issuers. And there is also another layer of reporting that comes in the labeled bond market. So this is impact reporting. So some issuers, and we do see this at Sustainable Fitch as best practice, report on the impact of those particular bond transactions. So they might say in their impact report that thanks to the investment into these green buildings, we managed to avoid a certain amount of CO2 emissions, or perhaps, thanks to investments into sustainable infrastructure, we managed to connect a number of people to those essential services. So I think what the labeled bond market brings is this transparency for the investor and a certain level of accountability on the side of the issuer as well, because there is a very clear commitment that they are making at the get-go that they will allocate these proceeds into these sustainable projects. And in this way, I believe that it helps when it comes to investing into, if you're following a strategy where you want to invest into a particular SDG or follow a certain theme, it does help because, for example, if you want to sort of look at clean energy, then so that's affordable and clean energy and SDG number 7. So then you will be inclined to go with the renewables use of proceeds, where issuers are committing to invest in solar or wind or hydropower subject to the taxonomy criteria. So I think these are the benefits really, whether the labeled bond market brings additionality, whether these are additional projects that the issuers wouldn't have undertaken otherwise, it's very hard to determine. And I know that for some investors, that additionality aspect is an important one. But I think, if we can have more transparency and more accountability from the issuers as to what the proceeds are allocated to, that's a very big plus for everyone.
Do you have a size, Martina, about some of the bonds that you've worked on that have failed to deliver? And what kind of size are we looking at? Because this is a fairly new market, of course, but you know, you guys are attached to a credit rating agency, and so you know you just have to walk across the hall to get to the credit rating agency. Has there been an example where a bond failed, or they failed to service their debt, given the assurance or the credit rating of this?
So when it comes to the labeled bond market, I think, you know, we have seen that a lot of the issuers in this market are quite large entities. So most of the issuers are probably real estate, utilities, sort of starting with utilities, including renewables, including diversified utilities. Then we will look at sort of real estate, telecommunications companies. I don't think we have seen a default yet when it comes to the labeled bond market. But I haven't conducted such a study, to be honest. So
I just think
Now,
that
if we-
you sit in a very interesting place because of the credit rating agency that they're attached to might have seen that. So I was just curious. Thanks.
yeah, no problem. I mean, you know, this is not a study that we've done, but in general, these are large issuers. So I would expect that, you know, if something has happened like that, it would be quite well known by now. And I also want to add that the credit rating agency, and so Fitch Ratings and Sustainable Fitch, are separate legal entities, because the credit rating agency is, you know, obviously subject to a lot of regulations, and Sustainable Fitch, I'm very proud to say, that already function as if regulated. So we have taken a lot of the best practices from the credit rating agency, and we're using that within Sustainable Fitch, but there is no sort of, you know, commingling of information, like all the data either stays within the credit rating agency or within Sustainable Fitch. Lydia, you were saying? Sorry.
Yes, no, thank you, Martina. I think, you know, I think it's an interesting topic that Tawny and Martina touched on, because obviously there's been a lot of challenges in the realm of sustainability when it comes to the accusations of actual companies greenwashing, green hushing, you know, lots of challenges that have been posed. And you know, when you think about the data, which Tawny, you work very closely with, and when you think about companies and how they improve their reporting and how they've been trying to adapt to the changes that we've seen across different jurisdictions as the way that sustainability is being measured becomes more sophisticated, and the requirements for companies actually publishing, you know, ESG or more sustainable or impact reporting becomes more of a requirement. So from your perspective, how is the sophistication around, you know, greenwashing that potentially could be an issue across, you know, certain sectors or with certain companies? How is that the next hurdle impeding effective investment from your perspective?
I could maybe just kick things. I think, you know, it is a big risk, a little bit the point I was making earlier, that even with the best data in the world, and then you've got to have the level of transparency that an individual investor, I'm taking that right back to the retail investor, can actually see what they are going into. Because as we know, every individual has a different set of values, a different view on what is right, wrong, and even in the environmental space where you think it's a bit more objective, what are the pathways to net zero? So we know at the European level, gas, nuclear are in there as transitional fuels, but lots of people who might go into funds that they think are sustainable then find out that there's gas and nuclear in there, and it doesn't correlate with their sort of world view of how you get to net zero, and you get problems. And I think there's been 3 articles I've noticed recently in the press shining a light on pension funds with fossil fuel holdings. And on this call, we'll probably know that some of those companies are probably leading the journey towards net zero and are real actors for change. And we also know that it's highly unlikely that many of the big energy companies are going to disappear over the next 30 years. They have to transition with the world, but yet that sort of more sophisticated, nuanced piece does not necessarily flow out and is therefore seen as greenwashing when somebody discovers there's a BP or a Shell in their portfolio. So yes, this is it's a key risk, because we need to maintain the support for all the work that's been done to build the infrastructure that tries to bring that level of transparency and also to sort of keep that pressure on companies making the change.
I mean, we don't even have to look at decarbonization, do we, Carl? I mean, I just take what happened actually the beginning of this month in May, is that that PSSI in Nebraska, they did everything right according to Blackstone, that they looked at databases, they made sure that the documentation was okay, but it just took one lone journalist to sit outside during a shift change and realize that they're employing children labor, 12 years old. Yet this company had done a very, very good job of reporting to their investors that child labor was not happening. They showed all the right paperwork, yet it was going on. So, companies are becoming much more sophisticated with hiding. No, I guess I wouldn't say hiding, but being much more sophisticated about what they're supplying their investors, what kind of data they're supplying their investors, or they're jumping through the hoops, and is going to need a more sophisticated investor to look behind those facades. So, we don't have to just look at decarbonization. We could, just look a couple of weeks ago at a child labor scandal that's blowing up in the United States. So, but one of the things that I think is working on our side is for ESG and sustainability type of metrics is the use of innovative technology. I mean, we can also use technology to help us give us a degree of comfort that on a granular level that the data is correct, and that it's timely, it's robust, it's transparent, and it has evidence, et cetera. So you can move from guessing about the information, the data that you get, or depending on Carl, you might go to a conference and talk to a client there, and the other information comes out that they speak out during a panel discussion. That's not actually the way the world's supposed to work. Everybody's supposed to get the same data all the time, right? But unfortunately, ESG and sustainability data has had a real history of, depending on whom you talk to and what conferences you go to, you might get a different set of data. But innovative technology can work really well on the investor's favor to make sure that the data is consistency and everybody gets at the same time.
Now, I think, when a lot of points that you've touched on in terms of, companies getting sophisticated in the way that they're, ticking the box on their impact or ESG reporting, yet they're still having, these issues, which if anyone looked through the face of it, as the case that you've mentioned, they're not following what they're saying that they're following, right? So there's this lack of corporate governance where they're reporting one thing but doing another. And when we think about, going back to, the accounting scandals that have happened in the past, what's happened post these accounting scandals has been higher regulation, more scrutiny on corporate governance. How do we make sure that certain individuals within the organization are not reporting things that are false, right? The Volkswagen scandal. I mean, there's lots of cases where you'll have individuals within the corporation, at the leadership level, taking decisions that result in data that is incorrectly providing information to the market, whether it's investors, whether it's consumers, et cetera. So when we think about this, what role does corporate governance play in helping to manage and better, tackle this greenwashing that seems to bubble up in certain companies in certain areas? How do we manage that and make sure that people companies are actually doing what they say?
Well, I suppose,
Martina, go ahead.
Okay, so I suppose, the answer is again, more regulation when it comes to corporate governance, and it has worked well to a certain degree when it comes to the accounting scandals that we saw in the past 30, 20, 10 years, I mean, it seems that, you know, there is a growing number of companies with good governance that really commit to those practices and making sure that the processes within the company run correctly, that the management are sort of screened on many levels, and that they truly are the people of responsibility that can be trusted to make decisions. So I think, you know, to me, the answer is the regulation focusing on corporate governance, because whether it's as you said, an accounting scandal, or whether it's fraud with regards to ESG data, or whether this is, you know, breaking labor regulations and employing children to, you know, to do the works that should never happen, then this is all fraud. This is all bad corporate governance. This shouldn't have been allowed to happen. So for me, this, you know, this just proves that the focus that we've had over the past sort of 20, 30 years on corporate governance is really what we need to continue doing as a financial community. Keep supporting those initiatives and making sure that the good processes are in place.
Do you think there's a role, Martina, for sort of regulating in the sort of B Corp status? So we operate as a B Corp, and yes, we're a sort of small firm, but there are an increasing number of large firms that are adopting the framework, and what that puts into the articles is a consideration that it's not the primacy of shareholders. You've got to consider alongside shareholders the environment, society, your customers, and your employees, and it's balancing all those requirements, and that is, you know, puts a different set of responsibilities on the directors of those companies. And I think, you know, that's an interesting tool for moving things forward. It comes with, you know, might be a bit of an idealistic view, because the politics of trying to achieve that, you know, in many jurisdictions will probably be quite fraught, but yeah, an interesting tool nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely like the fact that the companies that are making those steps and indeed taking into account not just the sort of the immediate stakeholders, but the broader stakeholders into account in their decision making, that they are sort of rewarded by having a certain sort of label or status. That's, yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of that.
So I think both of you touched on an important point in terms of, you know, the regulation and the corporate governance and the monitoring. If we think back to, you know, regulation, legislation, and, you know, the shift and the impact that it's had within ESG sustainability data, you know, how is all of that changing? And, you know, are we there? What additional regulation is needed? What are the gaps in the way regulation is being delivered right now? Is it too choppy?
I think that there's an area around unintended consequences to legislation. You know, not every challenge is, you know, requires a hammer. Some of them require a screwdriver or whatever. But so there's some unintended consequences. And one of the things I think that at least from EFRAG's point of view on the EU is they're trying to give kind of clear outline of what is good, what should stay inside the boundaries, and then they're allowing people to act within those boundaries, which allows for creativity and innovation as well. But I'm sure that Martina has something to say about this.
No, that's really interesting, Tani, what you said, that it is, you know, the challenges are not, when it comes to sort of sustainable investing, the different challenges need to be approached in a different way. And I think, you know, when it comes to, for example, you mentioned the EU regulating really strictly as to what's sort of green and which are the sustainable activities. And that's indeed what we see, but that creates a bit of a challenge for, you know, the companies that need to transition, that are not yet, and we touched upon this in this panel already, that are not yet meeting the EU taxonomy, but they are on the pathway. So how do we regulate what's on that pathway? Which science do we follow? I mean, there are many reputable third-party companies that that provide a lot of sort of guidance on this, but which one is the really reliable one?
Well, they are moving toward TCFD, at least on the climate change side of things. But I don't know, Martina, how long you've been, if you were part of the discussions when the EU taxonomy first came out. But they were, in the EU, they were very strict. It's like, this is brown and this is green. You know, there's like 3 colors. And I was very happy to see a couple of years later, they're saying, well, there's this deep brown and then light brown and then more neutral and light green and dark green. So I think they are recognizing that they have to be some more flexible to allow people flexibility to transition. So you're absolutely right. I think the beauty of when it comes to sustainability and ESG data is the fact that it allows, there's no hard and fast rule of what is good and what is not good. For instance, when I first started, everyone's like, well, we don't want to have any emissions. There's no absolute way that you cannot give emissions. Even me as a person, my own personal, you know, I emit carbon. So me emitting no carbon means I would be dead. So the question is, you know, how do we go from 0 to what good looks like? You know, what would best practice look like? And that is changing all of the time, actually. And the better we get at gathering the data, that's helping to inform, you know, what good looks like. So I'm very positive about some of the development within the legislation. Now the SEC is coming out with their recommendations, next week. And I was part of those discussions there as well. And I'm very positive that people are saying, let's figure out a way that it works for everyone. So all the noses are aligned. Let's all be solution providers instead of making it so hard and fast that either you're above the line or you're below the line. You know, we want to make sure that there is a pathway, there's a journey for everyone, no matter where you start.
It's interesting, Tawny and Martina, when you talk about, you know, the journey, the different levels of regulation that we've seen over the years, where, you know, initially much more strict, and over time opening it up to much more innovative solutions within companies, but also from a municipality standpoint. So what I'd like to do is kind of bring it back to Carl in terms of, you know, the net zero targets and thinking about, you know, all of these goals that have been committed at, you know, the national level, at the local municipality level. You know, for a municipality, you work with them, you know, quite closely in your work. What are the barriers for them to deliver on the net zero targets, and what is the progress that they've made? Carl, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think obviously councils in the UK have been very ambitious, you know, relative to even the UK government's sort of ambitious target for net zero by 2050. You know, there's the average council now in the UK has a sort of decarbonisation of their estate, net zero estate by 2030, and decarbonisation of their region by 2040. And these were all taken, you know, all these declarations were put in place, and these plans were initiated in around 2020. And I think we're now starting to see councils, again, sort of on average, starting to really grapple with the challenge of trying to deliver these really ambitious targets. And I'm a big fan of being ambitious, because I'd rather they fail at an ambitious target than fail at a weak target, which, you know, ultimately we're all learning on this journey, and failure is going to be part of the journey. But you know, I think the key challenge at the moment to really accelerating things is it's not a capital problem. There's lots of money that, you know, councils can draw on. It's what in council world is called develop projects, bring in the expertise externally to do the technical work, and having that competency and the resources within the council to actually deliver the projects that they have in their regions to do. And councils can be incredibly effective when they are resourced correctly, but at the moment there is a real challenge in that sort of development stage around getting projects to the point where they can be funded through what is quite a simple mechanism that the council has for funding, you know, shovel-ready projects. But it's, yeah, stage one where the challenge is at the moment.
Thank you, Carl. I think that's definitely something that puts a lot of light on the municipality side of things, and certainly, you know, we've talked a lot about the challenges at the company level, but clearly there is, you know, lots of challenges at the municipality level, and it's great to see different avenues that they're able to take to achieve supporting one. So if we think about that tectonic shift that we've seen, you know, for companies and ESG data providers into that double materiality realm, you know, I'd like to pose this question to all three of you. You know, do you see this double materiality where, you know, essentially companies are internalizing their externalities? Is that a passing phase where we'll see it fade away in the coming years, or do you see it becoming the dominant paradigm? Martina, would you like to kick it off with a response on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely think that double materiality is here to stay. And double materiality, again, takes me back to my sort of first comment that I made during this webinar, you know, differentiating between the investor or spending the ESG risks that are sort of that the company is exposed to, as opposed to understanding the impact that the company has on the environment and the society. I think, you know, the more broad understanding we have of double materiality as a society, the more this will help when it comes to, you know, even the way that we as retail investors approach our own investments. So I think it's here to stay, and with the regulations, with SFDR and CSRD in Europe, both the investors and the issuers need to be thinking about it, because, you know, if you look at double materiality, it was first introduced by NFRD in Europe, and it was more, you know, focused only towards the biggest issuers, towards the biggest companies. But now CSRD, I read that it will cover around 50,000 companies in Europe, so it is going to be very broad.
I probably agree with that from perspective. It is more in line with what people would expect from a sort of an ESG, if we use that badge, investment. So I think, you know, it has a use from that communication and engagement of people with their money to invest in this side of things, which I think will be very supportive. But Tony, I'm interested in your perspective.
I think I understand what double materiality is: the investor's impact on the environment, but also the environment's impact on the investment. Yeah, that makes sense to me. But to me, that it seems quite of the here and now, like what is it happening right now? And actually, companies are invested in because of their what does their growth process look like? What does the growth look like? You don't invest in just here and now unless you're a day trader. But
I'll just turn it on again. I'm not sure why it keeps turning off by itself. I think it has a little bit of a mind of its own. But we're getting there with the recording on. Sorry, I apologize. Please continue, Tony.
No problem. I think with investing, I mean, investing is actually about the resilience of the company and what is the growth plans of the company and the management, you know, what it does. So there's a timely element to it. And I think that double materiality misses that. And that's why I am more in the boat around dynamic or dual materiality. It's what kind of issues are popping up actually in the pipeline. How does a company need to be creative and innovative as those ESG or sustainability type of issues, material issues, kind of pop up through time. So I'm more of that. I think that double materiality is here to stay. Great, you know, that works very well for the here and now. But when we're talking about longevity, it's more of a challenge. Where I think dual dynamic materiality has a definite role to play. I hope that was recorded. That's all I'm hoping.
It was. So thank you for that. It's decided to take a mind of its own. So I think it's the last question, because we literally are out of time. So really, it's a shame. We really only had time to skim the surface today on this very engaging topic. But we will pick this up again in the next webinar. So first, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their time today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights. Thank you to those in the audience as well for listening to the topics that we've engaged with today. And I would like to give a special thanks to Robert Whitfield, Isra Jahan, and Ollie Henman for their help with the webinar. So we look forward to welcoming you again in the. Thank you. Bye, everyone.